arrogantly self-sufficient that they just simply don't want to cooperate. And then we've got multiple providers, police, correctional services and juvenile justice. So we've got multiple stakeholders, multiple providers, and it is not rationally designed. It grew like topsy. So multiple interfaces and interdependencies, inconsistent arrangements in different parts of the state. They just sort of grew up over time, and why police do this in one place and corrections do it in another is sort of often just an historical anomaly. Informal arrangements that rely heavily on goodwill, changing demand due to new technologies. Very, very typically the police want to withdraw from delivery. This is not something that they want to do. And of course the human rights issues that inevitably arise in this space. Now, it would be easy enough to go to the private sector and outsource. I mean, that's been done in a lot of parts of the world, and indeed it's been done in other parts of Australia. The privates, and you know, there have been some problems, but it works well enough. But the primary challenge that New South Wales faces isn't that, and to rush off and do that at the moment would be irresponsible, and it's just not on the table. The primary challenge is to rethink and redesign the system to take account of the needs of the various stakeholders, and at the moment they're confusing their needs as stakeholders with some of them with their involvement as providers, and reimagining how the service could be structured, given that, for example, we're introducing audio-visual links and we may just not need to transport as many people, although that is now being challenged because lawyers and people who sort of speak on behalf of prisoner groups are saying that audiovisual links actually are denying people some basic rights and the capacity to be properly involved in their own trial. So it's a complex and evolving space, and so the challenge here is to commission it or recommission it. The challenge here is to rethink it and to make sense of what is already a mixed economy. We've got this mixture of stakeholders and users and people who engage and bump into this system, and a mixture of providers, and there's no particular logical rationale about how it's structured. So, as I say, I use this just as sort of as an illustration of the fact that commissioning is just as useful and sensible a tool, as powerful a tool when we're dealing with a public-to-public arrangement than when we're dealing with public-to-private. Yeah? Questions, comments? So what I just really wanted to, I guess, illustrate there was why I'm not only speaking with a funny accent, I'm sort of bringing to this a slightly different, looking at this through some different lenses, and therefore that there might be some sort of value in this from your perspective in sort of seeing some of these problems in a slightly different way.
Just to orientate people, Gary, I know we decided we wouldn't share the detailed agenda since we probably won't stick to time, but do you want to tell people at this point how this tees up the rest of the day so people can...
Yeah, so we're going to have 2 sessions now on contracting. And that, as I said, it was something that I thought I wasn't going to be spending a lot of my life doing when I returned to Australia, but have kept being pulled back to it. And most recently, as a result of this report I did for the Business Services Association, looking at the market here, I had the opportunity to interview about 80 people, including 12 chief executives, or former chief executives, most of them current then, of the public service companies, and in 3 of the companies I was able to drill down and look at people in different functions and at levels, and then some union officials and some public sector people, although there was a bit of reluctance on that side. I did speak to some very senior people in Cabinet Office around this stuff, and in some of the major commissioning agencies. And in addition to sort of accessing the history of the reports in that space that are readily available or available with a bit of search, I'm a bit of a collector, so I have lots of sort of key documents including my own private notes from meetings that I attended in Number 10 or in Treasury, really going back to 1993 was when I was first deeply engaged here, and I moved over here in 2000. So I was sort of a deep dive, and both flagging up the issues that had emerged recently, but going back and saying in reality these problems have always been there, and people were flagging most of these problems. They may have got worse because you placed the sector under huge strain because of budgetary pressures, but these sort of fundamental issues, you've been told repeatedly about these things. Let's think about what that means for that. And so I've come back and will be, I'm raising with you the beginnings of a body of work about what are we doing with contracting? What is it that contracting does? How does it work when it works? What's going on here? And as you'll see, I have a little bit of a frustration because I don't think the academic community has helped you. I think the quality of academic work in this space is mostly pretty poor. And for reasons I don't fully understand, other than NAO reports and a few other things, the government hasn't really captured and learned what it's doing either, which I think is unfortunate because this country has led in its, you have exported social impact bonds and such tools. So I'll be doing that. We've got a, I hope he's all tied up. I have been in your hands. A guy from the MOD coming in who's done. Chew. We had a great talk over the phone. Terrific experience, and one of the things that's interesting about the MOD, I had a meeting with Adrian's people last week, and they're beginning to do some work looking at what can we learn. Defence is one of those things where contracting has been done for a very long time, and a whole range of different models, but some pretty sophisticated stuff, and they're going to keep doing it. It's just simply in the nature of defence that it's peaky, and you don't want to staff up to your peaks. So this is whatever may be done in any other department of government, defence is always going to be using contracting as one of its core tools, and so looking forward to that. And then the final session, I'm going to go through and unpack contestability. We're going to repeat that briefly next week, so but the contestability isn't competition. Contestability is potential competition, or the credible threat of competition, or benchmarking with consequences. And so that it has really interesting application in public to public. There's important lessons for when we contract, but it has really interesting application in public to public commissioning. So I will go through and explore and unpack contestability. It's a policy or an insight that began in this country, 96. There was a bit of work being done on it in 2000 when I arrived, and frankly, it hasn't been carried forward. The guy who sort of originally developed it, Chris Ham, some of you will be familiar with Chris Ham, when he developed that in 96 when he was up at Birmingham, and I rang him when I began this paper that I wrote on it and said, Chris, did you ever take that work forward, or has anyone taken that work forward? And he said, no, we sort of really never did. So we've actually picked that stuff up and are taking it forward in Australia in a more thoughtful way. So I'll be sort of unpacking some of that. Again, it's stuff that began here, has been dabbled with in a couple of places, but not really thoughtfully picked up and pursued and studied. So we'll be unpacking that in that final session.
No, the point you made earlier about the lack of learning in the UK, that there's been no feedback loop in learning. I just wondered why was that? It sounds like that's been the case for a decent stretch of time now, since the 1990s. That there's been no
1980s, going back to there was a bit of work done with the compulsory competitive tendering. There was a couple of good reports at the time, but no. Yeah. Why?
Why would that be?
I have no idea.
That's the frustration that I have, because it's quite good to look at Australia and New Zealand and see, as you said, there are quite a few differences, but at the same time I think there's always this thing around the ghost of Christmas present, past and future, where we could actually see that doesn't work. Not to be an Eeyore and say nothing's ever going to work, but at the same time, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And a lot of times with commissioning, you can look around the world and see different models, and the frustration I think that I have is that we can get it right and we can do all of these, but sometimes you just find successive governments or different administrations don't actually look at what is working. It just seems you just need to change it for the sake of changing.
Yeah.
And I find that very frustrating because I could see a lot of things, synergy between what so the examples in Australia that would work here are some things that we're doing that we just stopped, like you said, sites for no particular reason. It was discontinued or the learning wasn't right. But that's the frustration.
Look, particularly given the historic link between science and policy, as you know, there is this sort of long history of the scientific world speaking to the policy world, particularly in the sort of technical sciences. I find it's more baffling. I think some of the academics have too readily reduced it to ideology, and they've assumed that this was. So you hear about the new public management and so on, and they sort of put labels on things instead of looking at these things. I mean, one of the benefits of going back and studying contracting in the 18th century is you realise this has been done for a very long time, and it goes up and down, but it's been done for a long time. And so if it's round and it's the way we do things normally, we should be studying the tools that we use to engage with, well, public, private and not-for-profit, but certainly let's focus on the private and not-for-profit, just as much as we study and teach management. So that's not to say that there aren't pockets of good work, but they are pockets, and I'll talk about this. So and I've just arrived at a point. I mean, I'm an academic now, after years sort of in public and private sector working as a sort of more hands-on. I may sound like I'm talking my own book, but I've just decided I'm going to start talking it and just trying to make people feel guilty for the fact that we don't treat this as these are serious disciplines that need to be seriously analysed.
Could it be a symptom of the class dynamic that you've alluded to earlier, that policy
class? Look, I come from policy. My background is in policy. I think the policy, 40 years policy has sort of been growing, and it's fun. No responsibility. You can have a lot of fun games, and no one's ever going to hold you responsible.
But that attracts a certain type of person.
It does. And my wife has pointed out to me that some of my criticism of policy people, why shouldn't that apply to me? And to which my answer is, yeah, that's actually a really good question. And look, for me, having, I always had a cabinet office in New South Wales at a relatively young age. And I would be perceived as having been pretty successful. To come and then work with a service provider where you're interfacing with people most of whom had come from the public sector, with people who've got to make stuff happen day in and day out. And it keeps breaking day in and day out, and they have to keep fixing it day in and day out. To go and study those people and to learn what they were doing and how they functioned. And when I went back to Australia, my first piece of research, first big project, which I still haven't had time to publish, was interviewing the managers of frontline public services, public managers. And it's really interesting when you go and sit down and listen to them talk about the relationship with policy. So that's very humbling. I mean, you realise just how remarkable those people are, and by and large, the policy class don't understand that. So there is certainly some of that. Look, I think it's just got to change. I think there's just got to be, somebody pointed out to me, if you just took 1% of the money that we've wasted in really horrific government contracts over the last decade in this country, you'd have a pretty well-heeled research institution somewhere.
No.
And if anyone wants to do that, we would volunteer.
I changed my mind. That's a good idea.
Some of these things, I will come back on this in a minute, some of these things I think just have to be studied. You just need to sit down and look at them and study them systematically and think through why did it wind up going like that? Why did this thing that looked so promising wind up a disaster? We don't do it in Australia either. I think the academic community have let government down in this regard, and Australia is no better in this than the UK. when I first was coming over here in the late 90s, there were a few people around doing work, but that it seems to have dropped off. I don't know why. They sort of seem to have lost interest. So no, not well served. So we'll come back on that in a second. So that's sort of the rest of the day. And then next week we'll be sort of doing more stuff around system design, market design. I'll be unpacking the National Disability Insurance Scheme as a great case study and how great dreams can founder. Yeah.
Can I make a point? Just go back to your point about the prison transport thing. I'm just thinking about how the UK would approach that. And I think what we would do one of two things. We'd either basically redesign the thing, massively overspecify it, and then be surprised when not everyone did as they were told. Because that's quite often what we do with these kind of things. Or we'd outsource the entirety of the problem, and then be surprised if it didn't work. So I think they would be the classic.
And so you did the first of those.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I mean, there's a lot of jokes about Group 4 and the escaping prisoners. The reality is that actually worked brilliantly well, and all that happened was that they had a better system for revealing and disclosing how many were escaping. There were far fewer escaped on their watch. But you developed, through outsourcing it, a core of people who specialised in doing that particular function. And I could refer to particular contracts I have studied. I come over here twice a year for about a month at a time to go out into the field, go up into Norfolk and kick tyres and study interesting models. You've developed some really interesting innovations as a result of that. But a lot of the problems that Serco and G4S ran into in this area 2 years, 3 years ago was that they were bumping up against a whole lot of prison governors and magistrates and judges who had no interest, no reason at all to want to cooperate with a private provider who was in the middle there, moving people round. So in a sense, the fundamental design of the thing had not been fixed. And one of the interesting insights from a very, very good consultancy, and I mean it's one of the big ones, but it's this particular economist who works for them who deserves the credit, is that they did this work and said you've actually got two systems. You've got one system which works in the big metropolitan areas, the densely populated areas, and then you have a system that works utterly differently in remote areas. And there's at least two systems, and you've got to just think about those and the working of those separately from each other. Well, that's, you know, to have outsourced the lot, or to have outsourced, you know, blocks of that without an awareness of those sorts of things would have been, in my view, most unfortunate. So yeah, I mean, while outsourcing early has done some good things in the UK and led to some interesting innovation, I think there's still aspects of that system that because they hadn't been worked through and properly commissioned to begin with.
I wonder if part of the difference is because of different drivers, in that the outsourcing prison system in this country was significantly cheaper than what had been done before. Money is always driver. So you might get something that, so quite often I think the implicit thought is it might not be any better, but it's going to be cheaper. So the ambition is about money. So,
well, let me push back on that. Prisons happens to be an area where I've done an awful lot of work, and I began doing it here. And when I talk about system design and so on, I'm actually talking about a whole lot of stuff. That's a really interesting example, because up until the latter part of the Labor government, it primarily was. They were cheaper. But what the people who set that system up, either through accident or design, had managed to find was a system that was both more decent and cheaper. It turned out it was cheaper to run a decent prison than it was to run a nasty one. And Labor, through the early part of its years, used contracting explicitly, I've got a quote I'll use later on, explicitly to drive what it called its decency agenda. So here was, and I interviewed a number of those people who'd come across from the public sector who, when they began to say to the private companies, we want you to lock people up for longer, because the contract prisons allowed prisoners out of cell for much longer than the public ones had. A number of those people began to walk away from the industry. They said, I did not cross over to run these prisons to do more of that crap. So, as I say, accident or design, and I think it was probably a bit of both, they had managed to create a system that was both more decent and less costly. Well, that's a sweet spot. That's if you can manage to pull that off. And now you can't always do that. So I've done a lot of work on that. The first people who protested against the academics when the WALS, the first contract prison, was created, because the academics began to say, "Oh, this is a terrible thing. Look at America." And it was prisoners. I've got some of the letters. Prisoners writing letters to the newspapers saying, "Would you do-gooders go away? Because if I go to that prison, I'll be out of cell for 14 hours a day. At the moment, I'm out of cell for less than 8." And that's a conversation I have with them in Australia. And my starting point is, why wouldn't we go for 14 hours a day? We're working there. But one of the things that what we're doing in the public and private prisons in New South Wales is we're lifting the numbers of hours out of cell, and that will hopefully continue to lift. So that's actually an interesting example of where the contractors were asked to do it better as well as cheaper, and for a time at least it was possible to do that. And that's sorry?
That's what you're aiming for.
Yeah, well, I think that's a much better place. And by and large, providers, any decent provider would prefer to be in that space than just doing the same or worse cheaper. They'd actually like to think that they were doing a better job as well as doing it more efficiently.
The employees would.
Yeah, and the people at the front line, they don't go to work every day to make money for the boss. They go in order to do a good job. Doesn't matter who they are, public or private. That's the people at the front line are motivated by doing a great job. So that, when we talk about design of these systems and so on, and we'll come on to some of this in a minute with with contracting, paying attention to those sort of settings are important elements to what we're talking about here. And for those of you that haven't seen my Just Another Paperclip report, it's a rather Australian, if I can like, rather frank critique of a system where it primarily came to be about, well, almost big parts of it came to be just about price. So, shall we have a break?
Yeah.
And then we can.
Coffee. We've got fresh coffee.
Okay.
Thank you very much.